Welcome to Impact, a podcast by InnerSpace, where we explore the bold ideas shaping the future of the workplace. I'm your host, Jennifer Shannon, and today's conversation is about a pretty powerful idea. What if the best workspaces aren't mandatory, but rather magnetic? I'm joined by two guests who are not only deep thinkers, but hands on innovators in the world of work. First up is Dave Cairns, future of work strategist at Kadence, a company redefining how teams thrive in hybrid work environments with tools for desk booking, vendor visitor management, and workplace events. With more than a decade of experience in office leasing, negotiating over 6 million square feet of space, Dave brings real world expertise in how companies are using space. But it was the pandemic driven shift to remote work that truly reignited his tech native mindset. Today, from his base in Prince Edward Island, Dave is the creator of Beyond Hybrid, a popular content series spotlighting innovators in the evolving work landscape. On LinkedIn and beyond, he's known for sharp insights on autonomy, space utilization, and why distributed work isn't just viable, it's valuable. Welcome, Dave. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good introduction. I'll take it. I'll take it.
All right. Also joining us today is James Wu, CEO and co-founder of InnerSpace, and a visionary with over 2 decades of experience in UX design and startup innovation. James isn't just an executive, he's a product-driven leader who rolls up his sleeves alongside developers and designers to ensure every solution aligns with real user needs. At InnerSpace, he steers everything from product development to strategy, infusing deep customer empathy into a platform that helps companies transform workplace behavior into measurable outcomes. His superpower? Well, it lies in bridging design thinking, architecture, and engineering into cohesive, elegant products that work and scale. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Jen. Nice to talk with you again.
Nice to you as well. Together, Dave and James will help us explore what it takes to design workspaces people want to use, how behavior, not badge swipes, reveals true engagement, and why purpose should be the North Star of workplace design. Why don't we start with the big picture then? So, Dave, you have said that workplaces should be magnetic rather than mandatory. Help us unpack that a little bit and talk to us about what truly makes a space magnetic to the people who use it.
Yeah, I've said it slightly differently than that. And I think one of the inherent challenges of the times that we're in is that there is no office amenity. I use quotations for those that are listening rather than seeing. More valuable than the choice to go there or not. I think that is the inherent tension or friction that we are facing at scale now because of COVID. And I use this sort of like cheesy example, which is like if you offered me a first-class ticket to Paris and you said I could stay at the Ritz-Carlton, but the condition of that was that you said I had to leave right now. Like I had to physically get on the plane right now. I couldn't do it. I got my kid, I got to pick them up, or I got this meeting. Like there's so many different priorities that people are facing. And I think the biggest change since COVID is the fact that it's no longer socially acceptable for people to have to deprioritize their personal lives in the ways that they did before COVID that were just kind of normal. And so I do believe the workplace needs to be magnetic and draw people to it. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that that's the inherent tension that companies are facing. And there really isn't a traditional amenity like coffee or ping pong or golf simulators or amazing gyms that is going to be able to come up against that reality and make people feel like that is enough. And so the magnetic thing to me is intentional getting together. Like what is the tangible reason we are coming together? So some of the interesting ways I've seen that take shape are Kadence actually just signed a customer based in Brazil called Nubank. And Nubank is using their facilities more as cultural centers of excellence than offices in the traditional sense. And so each individual team, let's call it, or group within that organization is going to have different rhythms that they're going to come together with intention. Some of them are coming together every few weeks. Some of them are coming together every few months. Some of them might be just once a year or on a half-year basis. And so they're trying to think of creative ways to orchestrate their real estate around this more intentional gathering strategy rather than looking at a traditional office environment. And so I think that that's going to become more common over time, where we look at the office more like a cultural center of excellence than we do a traditional workplace. But it doesn't take away the other truth, which is that there is still going to be a contingent of the workforce that either needs or wants to come into that facility on a more like weekly or daily running rhythm. And we need to figure out how to re-engineer those environments to best support those people, but also not make them feel like that when they do come in, they're entering some ghost town that just doesn't feel inviting, right? Because whenever we go into a restaurant or whenever we go into a place that we choose to go into and it has no vibe, that doesn't really feel good and make us want to come back. So that's just sort of a high level how I think about it.
It's actually really interesting, that sort of cultural center. I hadn't actually thought about that before. This notion of intentionality is really interesting to me, just because we know that people are going into the office for intentions. But I think largely people are making guesses on that. James, how can organizations actually interpret behavioral patterns, so what they're doing when they do have that intention and come to the office, about how people are actually using and how they value different types of workspaces?
Yeah, I agree with Dave 100%. We if I could agree more than 100%, I would. We need to figure out what it is that makes people want to come into the office, and to your question, Jen, doing that involves seeing them as more than just headcounts, and seeing them as more as, seeing engagement with the office as being more than just, are they present or not, right? And so what we need to be able to do. So I think your question was like, how can we start organizing, or how can we allow organizations to start interpreting behavioral patterns, or how should they be interpreting their data to understand behavior versus just attendance? I think you have to step back a bit and ask, like, why should they be doing that? The why was what Dave addressed. Why is because we need to understand why people want to be in the office in order to make the office more of that and less of the stuff that we used to think of as being attractive to bringing people in, the traditional amenities. So how can they start doing it? They can start doing it by, first of all, expanding their notion of what do I need to understand in order to figure out what the office needs to be? And our strong, at InnerSpace, our strong hypothesis is you need to understand more than just presence. You need to understand more than just headcounts. What you need to understand is actual movement, actual interaction between not only people and space, like what, maybe the ping pong table is a reason people want it. I mean, I don't think that's true. I just couldn't think of a better amenity than the ping pong table. But maybe this particular thing is something that brings people in and people gather around it. Maybe because it fosters a great cultural vibe, to Dave's point, or maybe it's because it's there's a useful tool there for people to collaborate more effectively. So understanding the interaction between people and their space is one thing. But it's also about understanding the interaction between people and people, right? Most of what brings people in, most of why people want to come in, to Dave's point, is that cultural element, is that social element, the interactive element of, and it's not interacting with the digital whiteboard that somebody might have in Office 3A. It's interacting, James and Dave interacting, James and Jen interacting, Team A and Team B interacting, and the value they get, and the value they get from that interaction, and the what it brings to their overall workday. And so expanding the idea of what do we need to measure, what do we need to be able to understand, and what does interaction with the workplace actually look like, I think is key for organizations being able to start interpreting behavior versus just attendance, and use that interpretation to drive improvements in the workplace they build.
Makes me so hopeful. As someone who's worked in a ton of startup offices with a ton of ping pong tables, I can tell you that usually it ends up being an informal meeting room almost 90% of the time, because lack of space. So I think it's interesting that we're starting to look at how people are intentionally using spaces to make those decisions. I think that's pretty cool. Dave, based on what you're seeing in the field, and through your work on Beyond Hybrid, are there any standout examples, positive or negative, that show that there are some companies out there that are applying these kind of ideas that you and James are talking about in real life, and what, if any, repercussions those are having?
Yeah, I had an amazing opportunity since joining Kadence in April of 2024 to do a lot of traveling. So I've traveled all around the US and Europe, some Canada. And it's interesting that some of the most busy office environments are ones that haven't even, to use the term haven't remotely mentioned a mandate once. And so to me, one of the marquee examples of this is Atlassian. And so Atlassian is a company whose bias, I guess, in theory, would be the antithesis to a commercial landlord, in the sense that they sell digital collaboration tools that enable people to work really well from anywhere. But in doing that, one of the things they've done really well is they've studied a complete tectonic shift in the way they look at work since COVID. And they have a team that's called Team Anywhere, and they've released a report in late 2023 called 1,000 Days Working Distributed. And what they are measuring is more, how are people organically using their office environments without a mandate? And what are the implications of coming together with intention or not, right? And so I think those are really the things that we should be measuring. Like, if you think about it, if we make this environment that we have available today open to anyone to use, how are they using it, right? What are they organically doing when they come in? And then if we help nudge intentional connection, what does that do for the organization? And what does it do if we don't? Because I think we all are creatures of habit, and sometimes we need to nudge each other to get together, right? Like, to get together with a meaningful intention. You could think of like a cheesy example being like a family standing dinner, that you do on Sunday night. Perhaps if there isn't someone that, really makes sure that that event happens, it may not happen, right? And so I think the same is true in work. And so what they've found is that if they intentionally bring teams together once every 4 or 5 months, the trust that sort of has an exhaust after that of a similar period of time, another 4 or 5 months thereafter, where that breaking bread together keeps that connection between those teams high for the next 4 or 5 months after. But if they don't meet up again, it starts to dissipate. And then that leads to engagement problems, that leads to productivity problems, that leads to overall cultural problems within the organization. So they now have a data-driven approach to that, and they bring people into their cultural centers of excellence in places like New York, San Francisco, Sydney, for that reason. And they'll fly them in from various parts of the world. Now, the other thing that they've tracked is organic daily office attendance since COVID. And before COVID, something like 14% of their hiring was done remotely. And by 2023, by really flipping the script on the way that they operated, that number jumped to 57%. So a very significant increase in remote hiring. And the way they define that is if you're 2 hours or more from an office location, which would just make it really difficult for you to go unless you were forced to do that, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And of those that are within a commutable distance, something like 25% of them are coming in by choice 1 or 2 days a week to really just frankly to do their jobs, like not necessarily to, collaborate in this blissful way that we all like to romanticize. Because the truth of the matter is a lot of collaboration is actually done in at least a hybrid capacity, in the sense that not everybody's going to be in the same room at the same time, even if some of them are. Like, it's just teams are distributed by their very nature, right? And so that's very interesting. But what changes dramatically over time for them going forward is that, yes, 25% or so are within a commutable distance and are organically coming in 1 to 2 times a week, but their hiring efforts are becoming more global, which means that number is going to shrink over time in terms of like the denominator, right? And so I think, in essence, what I'm saying is that the dependency on office space to do day-to-day work is, I'm sure it will normalize at some point. It's not just going to like go to zero, but right now we're on a path to normalizing what that looks like. And we're also on a path to establishing how we bring together people with intention. And we do it in our personal lives a ton, right? And we actually set up environments to facilitate certain rituals, right? So a great example I can give you is we run an Airbnb, my wife and I, and she's put together this incredible coffee bar that's got every type of coffee you could possibly imagine, right? So whether you come from a different part of the world and your cultural way of making coffee is one way or another, you can make it. If you have just a certain preference, you can facilitate it. And that then leads to those rituals of like sitting out on the deck and having a conversation and, building trust or rebuilding connection with one another. And so it's like this combination of the physical environment being set up to help nudge those types of rituals along, and then letting people just do their thing, right? And so in our personal lives, we know we need to like spend quality time with our family, and either we don't do it or we do it, but we know it's important. And the same thing is true in business, obviously. And so the more important thing than the coffee bar is just making sure we do it.
Yeah.
But then I think there is an element of making sure that the space actually reflects what would help facilitate those rituals of connection. And I'm sure, frankly, James's data around how people are actually moving through environments, how they're using space, could help inform how that works. And I really believe in what he's doing, so much so that I've put in front of him various customers that can use Kadence for one thing, but could be augmented by the great work that they're doing, particularly with Wi-Fi data and understanding how people are moving through facilities.
It's a great segue. Before I go there, though, I can honestly, I'm sure I could speak on behalf of James and I would say we would like to intentionally spend some time at that coffee bar. It sounds incredible. James, is someone who's working directly with clients, so that you've got, you've got big enterprise clients that are looking for ways to make this sort of meaningful workplace, this magnetic place where people can come and have these intentional experiences, be they cultural or work related. How are these organizations using actual behavioral insights to make these kinds of decisions? Like, what are some of the kinds of patterns you're seeing emerge over the past couple of years with your clients?
Well, one of the, I think, most interesting metrics of data that we're able to present to customers, and one that once they wrap their head around it and because it's new to them, right? Like traditional approaches of collecting the kind of data that or collecting, say, utilization data or occupancy data don't allow interpretation of movement in the way that we do, right? And so one of the interesting things has been learning alongside our customers, what exactly can movement tell you? And when we first started talking to, this was probably maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when we introduced this idea of movement and being able to monitor it and look at pathways and start characterizing movement at a team level or a group level, a cohort level, in terms of mobility scoring, and being able to assess how mobile or not mobile is a group within an organization, and what does that mobility mean about their experience on site, and what can that mobility say about how you might make decisions around where do people sit, what teams do they need to be sitting near, what kinds of resources, whether it's collaboration spaces or heads down desks or what have you, what kinds of things should they be near in order to optimize both the cultural experience, the collaborative experience that people have in when they come into the office, and also the overall just the objective productivity in terms of, I waste less time moving and I spend more time working or being productive, being collaborative, being interactive with my teammates. And so, we worked with a company, this was about 2 years ago, and we got a case study somewhere on the website, wherein we demonstrably proved to them that by reorganizing, as they were in the middle of a restack exercise, right? They were sort of closing one building and pushing people, densifying the other building across the street. And we were able to show to them that if you think about this and you look at the patterns of movement and the patterns of interaction, both between people and the resources they've got, the amenities that they've got, whether meeting spaces or otherwise, and people and their colleagues, how do teams interact? You can make intentional decisions about how do you optimize to minimize the need to spend time moving. Like particularly when we talk about customers who operate large campuses or really large buildings, we tend to have customers that are on the larger end of the scale. That time spent moving is not trivial, right? Like if your experience is, hey, I work on a single floor plate in a high rise, walking from one side to the other is not a big deal. If you work on a campus where there's 10, 20 buildings, and moving from one building to another or moving from floor 1 to floor 5 in those buildings, that is time spent when you could otherwise be being more productive. It's time spent when you could be otherwise be either focusing on your own work or interacting with your colleagues. And so thinking about how do we optimize space, not just for the kinds of amenities, but even how do we put the people together in the space, and how do we enable the people to spend less time actually doing the interactivity that we want them to be doing, and less time just kind of moving.
It's funny. I've worked in organizations that very much said, hey, marketing sits on the second floor and sales sits on the second floor and the tech people sit on the fourth floor. And there was no real sense of that intentionality, which I think is important. And once, we rejigged that a little bit to project teams started sitting together and collaborating and sharing more time together, we actually had 3 really great ideas that came out of that. So aside from just the movement aspect of it, there's that whole notion of putting people that are like-minded together or are sharing experiences can be very powerful. I think that's really interesting.
Also, understanding movement, I'll just add, understanding movement starts to identify some of those connections between teams and between groups within an organization that you may not have actually understood were valuable, right? Like people predict, we'll put the sales team and the marketing team together, like, of course, right? But I mean, you and I have worked together in a past life, right? And I was up on the product team and then in the design group. You're down with the PR and the marketing team. There's no good sort of, nobody would necessarily predict that I spent a lot of time working with you guys, right? And so understanding these patterns of behavior, or being able to measure and detect these patterns of behavior, can start informing decisions that you might not otherwise make intuitively.
Yeah, exactly. It brings us to an interesting thing about, measuring and tracking and to gauge success or to track attendance. And a lot of organizations are still relying on badge swipes, occupancy counts to track usage rather. Dave, what are companies missing when all they're looking at is a badge swipe data as a data point of that they can leverage in some way within the organization about how people or who is working within that space?
Yeah, before I maybe discuss what I think they might be missing, I think it's important to articulate that there are actually better ways of doing it, figuring out who is there than badging. And Kadence actually has an interesting play on that. We have a desktop application that can go out on employees' laptops, very similar to installing ChatGPT as an app on your laptop. And in the back end of that feature, we are able to automatically check in space reservations or automatically check anybody in that comes into the facility simply by them powering on their laptop and connecting to the Wi-Fi network. And so that's just a more accurate and frictionless way of doing it, and it can feed into a better analytics platform than having everything kind of be disparate, these data points, and living all over the place. There are reasons you obviously want to know that people are on site, particularly health and safety is one, right? You do generally actually want to know who is there. So there is a relevant use case from that point of view. And then the policy side of it is really interesting. We do help facilitate answering that question for employers through Kadence, and I'm sure James could probably do the same thing. I try not to actually judge it too harshly, because I think we're kind of just in a progressive, moment of if I gave you that example earlier where I think we're desk usage to just do work for the day is sort of declining, certainly starkly since COVID. It's not going to go to zero. That just doesn't make sense, and it won't happen. But we can't sit here today and say we know what average daily, get shit done work looks like in an office. We just don't really know at this point. And frankly, I think that is probably the main, as I riff on this in real time for you, I think the problem with measuring attendance in that way is it isn't going to get organizations to the honest truth about how much organic use of that office for day-to-day work is actually a thing, right? They're effectively going to be artificially propping up the usage of their spaces by mandating that attendance. And if we look at macro data, we can see, and Nick Bloom, who's sort of one of the predominant researchers on hybrid and remote working. If you don't follow him, I recommend checking him out. He put out some research lately that basically, I'm going to simplify it for this case, but like younger CEOs are something like 2 times more likely to allow for flexible and remote working than older CEOs. And so I'm not here to be ageist, but there's clearly some data there around younger companies just being more accepting and embracing of flexible working. And so we will reach a point where millennials and even then Gen Zs will become the predominant decision makers in the workplace. And these folks are not going to mandate people to come into the office. It's just not a cultural norm that we have, right? And of course, I acknowledge that there are folks in Gen X and Boomer that also don't think that makes sense. But if I was thinking about how to future-proof my organization, I would want to know organically, how are people using space from a day-to-day perspective, and how can I maybe persuade them to see the same value in that Sunday night dinner or that family vacation in the context of work, where it's like maybe not everybody wants to do it, but there's a clear value proposition in terms of like the social cohesiveness that is there to then have that trust, have that connection to be able to do the important work wherever that work is ultimately happening. So yeah, as I just try to like put a bow on this, it's basically to say measuring attendance is not a good long-term strategy. It's just, it's not.
Yeah, InnerSpace actually has a great blog about this phenomena called coffee badging. You know, this idea that people could, badge in, have a cup of coffee, and then they dip, right? So there is no real work happening. It's a mandated sort of an RTO check, right? So agree with you 100% that it is really not a long-term. There has to be something else that you're looking at with regards to what is happening in your space, not just someone showing up, right? So, James, how do you think that organizations need to shift their thinking around this kind of data? So, what should they be looking at if they want to truly measure success or even to measure the success of their RTO policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dave was kind of touching on that, right? The idea that just attendance is the thing that is going to measure whether or not that is. I mean, it's a measurement, right? Attendance is a measurement, and the question is it a measurement that means anything, and do you care? And are you making decisions based on relevant data, or are you making decisions that just make you feel better because maybe you are of an older generation and your expectation of work is people have their butt in the seat 9 to 5, right? And if you mandate people back, you can sit back in your executive leather-bound chair and feel comfortable that, hey, look, numbers are going up. But
leather-bound, good call there. Leather-bound. Very vital. Very vital. Like, yeah, if someone's listening, you can picture it. Yeah.
And you can feel good, right? Like you're not only comfy, but your numbers are going up, and you can now sort of calm yourself or soothe yourself and feel like, okay, things are getting back to normal. But the reality is, Jim, you pointed it out, things like coffee badging, right? We actually had this exact situation with a customer, I think a year and a half ago, maybe it doesn't matter what, right? But we engaged with them just slightly after they had just given a report to their executive about how RTO, how the mandate that the executives had given had sort of handed down to the team. How was that going? And they had just made this report. They'd done the report based on the badge swipe data. And great news, executive team, badge swipes are going up. And then at the same time, in the background, we're implementing our solution, which allows them to really understand, occupancy and some of the table stakes stuff people want to know, but also all of the more colorful things that I've been talking about, mobility being one in particular. And it was about 2 or 3 weeks after they'd given this great raving report around how the badge swipes were going up, and therefore work was getting back to normal. And we kind of step in and show them like, hey, you don't have a coffee badging problem here. You actually have a lunchtime free food in your cafeteria problem, wherein people are, like, lo and behold, like the badge count data they had said, yes, someone came, or yes, no, somebody didn't come that particular day. Didn't have to badge out, so they have no sense of how long people were on site. And, our early reporting to them was like, hey, you guys have a lot of people coming in like at around 11, and a lot of them are just going up to the 3rd floor where the cafeteria happens to be. And a lot of them are only staying for about 45 minutes, an hour before they're bouncing. And that's a pattern of behavior and a pattern of movement that told them something and actually forced them to make changes to their policies in order to actually start to achieve some of the more meaningful engagement with the workplace that they were trying to achieve, but had no way of measuring whether or not it was real, simply by looking at the very unidimensional data of, is somebody there or not?
I love that that was less of a punitive approach and more of a curiosity approach. Like, I think that's where the value is going to come in, is that companies get curious as opposed to, you must be here Monday, Wednesday, Friday,
Mhm.
but more curious about why and how they can make it so. I think that's interesting. We've talked a whole lot about a usage and engagement here and measurement. I want to step back just a little bit here. Dave, how does thoughtful workplace design support broader goals like employee experience, employee well-being rather, and sustainability?
On the design front, I'll just put my hands up and say I'm not the expert in that domain. That being said, I gave you some examples already about how if you actually watch how people are using space, or you help nudge rituals, it can really inform whether that space is enhancing that outcome or taking away from it. And so I think that's just an important question to always have in your mind. And for most companies, they're still spending time trying to evaluate how the existing portfolio of real estate they have best supports that or doesn't, right? Like something like 55% of leases have yet to expire. Many companies have been making real estate decisions based on hybrid policies that will not work over the long term. And so we're still really in this limbo period where either the space hasn't been modified because the lease hasn't expired, or people are betting on the wrong thing. And so, I mean, really, truly, I keep coming back to it, like watching what organically happens versus what actually happens. So, like, James's example is a good one. I'm in my head as he's talking, I'm thinking, on the one hand, it's not such a bad thing that that people are coming in and getting a free lunch. That probably helps with engagement. I can say I was recently in San Francisco and I was at Airbnb's offices. I was at Atlassian's offices, and the fact that they offered me a free lunch, not only free but healthy, felt really good. Like I actually got better food and didn't have to pay for it there than what I would have been able to facilitate for myself. But the downstream implication of not doing anything about that is that you end up with this glut of real estate that is just designed not fit for purpose, and is just contributing massively to carbon emissions and things like that. So I'm not the design guy, but I will give you an example that I think is really interesting to think about and how technology could help with it in terms of where people decide to locate themselves to have some sort of gathering or meeting. And so I think it would be really cool, and Cadence is going to get to this point, where when folks make a meeting a request, like let's just say they book a space, they go and they book an event space, or they book a conference room at their headquarters location. It would be great if, especially through AI, we could actually tell them, hey, you know what? This other third-party co-working location is more equidistant to the geography of all 4 or 5 of these people. You should actually meet there, just because organizationally, like, it's going to be easier, like, to get your time and energy spent going to a place that's more equidistant. But here's also the savings that you will make, and you will contribute to the organization in terms of emissions from the point of view of travel, and from the point of view of how companies can look at actually powering or not powering the real estate that they hold a lease or ownership stake in. And so I think there's a really amazing opportunity to look at things that way. But yeah, I wouldn't be the design guy, unfortunately, to really get into the weeds on how space design
But
can
that's a
affect things.
really cool idea that you've brought up, right? Which is that workplaces are now focusing on prioritizing the collaboration, the work itself, rather than the location where it exists, right? So making sure that the location where they're working matches what they need to do. I think that's actually really interesting. And yeah, like if there are employees that all work 2 hours away and they're, within that 2 hour distance, you could say, hey, here's a location that actually works for you, that's part of the ecosystem of the office, even though it's a virtual part of the office. I think that's a pretty smart way to go at getting people to get together to do really great work. I think it's really cool.
Can I make one more plug, actually? Because something
course,
just
yeah.
came into my head. So there's this guy who's a friend of mine. His name's Brett Hawtop. He led Workplace at LinkedIn for a long time, and he now runs a company called Workshape, which does some consulting work, and also they host events for senior workplace leaders. And he does some really cool stuff. Like, he'll get you to come into his event, put your phone in a cardboard bag, and like leave it over there with ideally the intention of just like being there. And don't worry, if someone urgently calls you, we'll let you know, kind of thing. So you can just kind of be here now. I think that in and of itself is interesting. But he then will take you through these different exercises throughout a half day where they'll get you to like collaborate on a task in different space designs. So like if you're meant to do something really collaboratively, but you're doing it with like large, tall partitions, how does that feel versus having like a wide open table where you like, plop a map on it and you're trying to like plot points or something like that? Like, how do you feel in one versus the other, right?
Yeah.
And it really is powerful to actually understand how you feel, because I think most people don't really have that option, right? Like, they just have to come in and make use of whatever space is available that the company offers, and often they're getting it wrong, right? Or what does it feel like to have a meeting about a certain subject while walking with someone around a track versus staring them like dead in the face? Like, maybe a more conflict-oriented conversation is better to be had walking than like staring each other down, right? And so I think that's when you get into design too, right? Like when you get into design thinking, when you start thinking about what are the tasks people are trying to achieve, and how much or how little of that space do we need based on the size of our workforce and the types of things that we're trying to, orchestrate or facilitate.
Making the way we work or what we're working on essential to the decision. I think that's really powerful. That sense of care that, in design, it does send a very strong cultural signal, and it shows that people are being considered, which I think is extremely important. I know that that would be important to me, knowing that my employer that is designing my workspace wants the best space for me. James, from your side, organizations are connecting data to the impact that it's making on an everyday basis, especially around sustainability or carbon reduction. How do you see that playing out in the workplace in terms of, let's say, the well-being of not just the employee base, but of the planet?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the kind of the more obvious side of it, right? Like there's the impact to a carbon footprint is measured, to a certain extent on a per square foot basis. And so when you're operating more square feet, you're just multiplying how much, that ownership of the impact of your footprint is higher, right? So if I operating 1 million square feet but I could operate in 500,000 square feet, I can have a meaningful impact, at least on paper, and at least to my sort of per capita contribution to carbon emissions in the planet. I can reduce it. The reality is, if you were operating 1 million square feet and now you've been figured out how to get down to 500,000 square feet, that other 500,000 still exists. It's just it's somebody else's problem, really, or it's not somebody else's problem, but it's somebody else's responsibility, let's say, right? And so you might say, okay, well, that's just putting the ball in someone else's court to worry about. But by doing that, the actual knock-on impact is somebody else doesn't have to build 500,000 square feet of new facility in order to house their new business, in order to house their expanding team, right? So there is this sort of doubled up effect, wherein one, I can be more responsible and more efficient with my production with the impact that our footprint has on the world. And two, I can actually free up existing space so that a team can, so that somebody who might otherwise go and cut down some nice trees and lay a big pad of concrete and build a building on it because they need space, maybe I can prevent them from doing that as well.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So
I like
that might be
that. Preventing people from building buildings. So yeah, it's important.
Yeah, big time.
It really is, right? Like it sometimes is very easy to forget, right? Like because I go in and we're trying to obviously sell our own product and convince people that There's an ROI here for you, and you're going to save money on your HVAC, and you're going to save money on your facilities footprint, right? There's a bigger picture here where it's like, that song, whatever, put up a parking lot. They built a paradise, put up a parking lot, right? Like the bigger picture here is like, hey, maybe we want more paradise and less parking lot. In which case we have to do something to use the parking lots we've got more efficiently, so that we don't need to keep building more and more and more of them, and we can make not only just make better use of the ones we have, but obviously there's a whole lot of other work to be done to at the per square foot level actually reduce the impact that each square foot has. So that's kind of the big picture stuff. And then even in terms of connecting data to an impact on a more micro scale, one of the really interesting things that I heard a customer talking about, and when they were looking at the mobility data, again, I keep going back to this mobility data, was their change in thinking around how they do recycling and garbage on each floor, right? Wherein it used to be for convenience, I guess, of housekeeping, that they would centralize garbage and recycling at the kitchen in the middle of the floor, right? And the expectation on the people, the expectation was that if people go and put their recycling in the kitchen, then it's much easier for housekeeping to come and clean it up, right? Because they don't need to go and pick up at every desk. But then what happened was people were doing a lot of moving, but two, actually, they tended to be actually being less thoughtful around their recycling and their garbage kind of sorting and whatnot. And it was just because it was this big thing, you got to go and do it, versus distributing, putting the onus obviously on housekeeping to go and do it all, but distributing smaller individual buckets of garbage and garbage receptacles and recycling containers so that people could do it at their desk. And what they found was more got recycled. So not only did people spend less time walking to and from in order to deal with their recycling, but actually recycling, the behavior of recycling went up, which I thought was, it was just one of those little things you hear, like, well, that wasn't our observation. That wasn't our client services team saying, hey, look, check out this thing we figured out for you. That was something I heard back from them. It was very cool.
I think office managers everywhere are applauding. I think I can even hear them. Thank you for bringing that good idea, they're saying. Yeah. Hey, gentlemen, this has been a really good conversation. I really, really appreciate it. And I just love that you're seeing this commitment to the employee experience, this commitment to doing things differently, especially in a post-pandemic era. I'd like to leave you with a closing question. So I'd like to ask you each the same question. Dave, let's start with you. What's one thing that workplace leaders should prioritize right now if they want to create spaces that people truly want to use?
It's a deep question. Force people at the top to measure organic behaviors. I guess that's been my primary theme throughout this whole conversation, like what's actually happening, so that they can plan accordingly for the future around reality, not around these sort of like manufactured policies that just aren't going to stand the test of time and are slowing down progress.
James, how about you?
Yeah, I think one of the really, really important things for leaders to recognize when they're thinking about workplace is that they, meaning the leadership, are not necessarily representative. Their attitudes towards work, they're not only their attitudes towards work, but their attitudes towards being in, their involvement with the company, the way they behave when they're on site, all of those things are not, in many cases, not at all representative of how the rank and file think about work and engage with work, and what motivates, the lion's share of the people in the company to come in and do good things, right? And so if it's very easy, I think, for a leadership to be like, well, I want to be here, and I'm going to come in, and I understand the value of collaboration, and I want to check the box and be present, and or even actually, I want to be able to monitor productivity, and I want to be able to monitor performance, and I do that best when I'm sort of observing all the 20 desks of the people in my department, right? That behavior and that need is not reflective of what the vast majority of the rest of the organization are looking for and what they want out of work and what they're trying to achieve and what makes their day more productive versus less productive. And so getting out of your own head first and getting out of this sort of conceit that, hey, what I do is what's good for me is good for everyone else, and start truly looking and start truly understanding what is everybody else doing, regardless of what I do, right? Like maybe I want to come in every day and sit at my desk and do my stuff in my private office. That might be great for me, but that's not working for everybody else. Not everybody else even has that opportunity. So getting out of their own head and recognizing like, I want to look at the reality of what's going on the ground so that I can make real impactful decisions.
That's great advice from both of you. Thank you, both Dave and James, for sharing your insights and your experience with us today. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone listening. If this conversation has sparked a new idea or given you something to think about, we'd love if you shared the episode or sent it to someone who is thinking about the future of work in a more human way. You've been listening to Impact, a podcast by InnerSpace. I'm your host, Jennifer Shannon, and we will see you next time for another great conversation on the future of workplaces. Thank you.